Thank you, JLF, for having us here for what promises to be a little different from our conversation yesterday, which was about frontline journalism. This is really about the books that our journalists have written. You know, when war comes to your country, everyone loses something. But a journalist covering a war in their own country loses their country twice. First, because they are citizens, because it is their families who are at risk. But second, because they need to try and be objective even when the war is against their own country. Ghaith Abdul-Ahad became a translator during the war, then a journalist. He's traveled beyond Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and other conflicts. Yaroslav, as you've just heard, has traveled the world as well, covering conflict. He was the Wall Street Journal's bureau chief in Afghanistan and Pakistan, so closer to us. He had a column on the Middle East as well, until the war came home for him in Ukraine in ways that nobody had really expected it to. We've followed both of these journalists over Twitter, through their works, but their books, and it has been such a pleasure really to read them both. Just put the truth as bodily as you can. So I'm actually going to ask them to read from those books. But I want to start with a general question. You know, both of you write about the moment of war, just before the war, 2003, and for you in 2022. You know, there are authors in India who write about, say, for partition, for example, and say, what you can tell about somebody from that, the thing that they most cared about is what they took from their homes as they were fleeing, for example. I want to ask you, as journalists who know a war is coming, who know a little bit more than perhaps everybody else does, what's first on your mind when you hear the missiles are about to land? Is it about your family, securing your family? Is it about your pets? Is it about getting the story? Go ahead.
So, I mean, thank you, JLF, for inviting me. It's a special place, India. My grandfather came with the first British invasion to Iraq, second actually. He was an Indian army officer. So I love India. Thank you, India. So what do you feel? I mean, I have to be very selfish in answering this question by saying you feel like you are in history. You see American tanks down your street. You see the statue of Saddam falling, that dictator that dominated your life for so long. So I have to be honest and say I didn't think about anything else apart from just opening my eyes and trying to record every single minute of this historical moment. You realize that you're living, and of course, growing up in Iraq, war is not a strange thing. So my first war memory was when I was 5. Then the Americans bombed Baghdad in 91. And actually, the Americans have been bombing Baghdad non-stop from 1991 up until a couple of months ago. So you know war. You're used to the sound of missiles. You grow up in these kind of military dictatorship. But when you see the Americans down your street, it's a very different experience. And you realize you are in history. That day, my life as an architect it ended. And I became a journalist or a writer.
And of course, Ghaith's book is called A Stranger in Your Own City. It's really what you become, and it's the title of this. Yaroslav, what was the first thought in your mind when you were told, I think, by one of the opposition politicians that the war was coming?
Yeah, I think the difference is that Ukraine was not used to war. Yes, there was a Russian-sponsored invasion in Donbass and in Crimea, but Kiev had not been bombed since 1943. And the idea of war was, you know, something unthinkable to so many people in Kiev at the time, despite all the warnings coming from US intelligence. And I remember walking the streets of Kiev that day and thinking, it's because, for me, was, you know, drove on a rented SUV from Kuwait to Baghdad just as the statue of Saddam was falling, and has seen, you know, how quickly everything can be appended and life transformed in invasions in places like Libya and elsewhere. It was evident something was going to happen.
Yes.
And it was really jarring to see how people were just refusing to process the information. And yes, indeed, so I did go to see the former president of Ukraine, Poroshenko, a day before the full-scale invasion. And we had this very, milquetoast interview, after which he leaned towards me as I was saying my goodbyes and saying, it's going to be tomorrow at 4 a.m. You still have, a few hours to rush to the airport and get the hell out of here if you want to. And in fact, very many people were doing just that. Obviously, I had come to Ukraine to cover the war. And so what I did was to call all my colleagues and friends, many of whom had gone to the front lines in the east, to come back to Kiev and to tell them that, once the Russian tanks roll in, nobody will really care about what happens to a village near Avdiivka.
You probably saved their lives.
Well, at the end of the day, no, because actually those front lines didn't move much, and nobody knew how it was going to look. Everybody was expecting this massive shock and awe. All the bridges over the Dnieper River that runs across Ukraine would be blown up, and the expectations were that the Russian army would be much stronger than it ultimately proved to be.
It was. And I want to discuss that a bit as well. Both of you have, in a sense, embarked on books where you don't really know the ending, because that's the nature of the conflicts we cover these days. It's not like World War II reporters who could go home and sit peaceably and talk about a war that had already been won or lost and was over. People who were dead, the ones who had survived would survive. Is that difficult, to write your book without knowing an ending?
I mean, when you embark on a story like Iraq, for example, you don't know the ending, as you say. And very soon, the original war, which is an invasion, an occupation, turns into a civil war. And then the civil war, as all civil wars, start fragmenting into separate wars. So in the beginning, you are just chasing news. You're running after car bombs. You're trying to stay alive. You're trying to, not be kidnapped or killed by the Americans, by the militias, by the jihadis. But then eventually you start seeing how the society is fragmenting and how the city where you grew up, where you lived, your neighborhood, as Yaroslav was talking yesterday, is fragmenting. And then you try to tell the story. First, I was a journalist, and I was trying to tell what's happening in Baghdad. And then, probably a decade later, I realized, you know what, I'm also from Baghdad itself. So let's talk about the city itself and what's happening to the city. What's happening to my friends, and where are they? No, of course you don't know the ending, and this is why it took me 20 years to write this book, because every time there is a new stage in this civil war, and it continues.
Yara?
Well, I tried to give a cutoff to this book. This book is really about just the first year of the war. So it starts the day before the invasion, and the main narrative ends on the one-year anniversary of the invasion, where Ukraine is still fighting. The war is still going on.
Which is February 24, 2023.
Right, but I think the basic principle that Ukraine will survive as an independent country had been secured in this first year. And so the final passages in the book is, President Zelensky holding this one-year anniversary press conference, looking very worn, where, with the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, a year of sleepless nights, and he's saying, we have learned one thing in this year. It's the world, it may be cruel, it may be unfair, but nobody likes losers. Yes. And so we cannot be losers.
And he changed the narrative,
yes,
in a sense. But I do want to, and then get into talking about the books themselves. Yaro, we're in 2025. Donald Trump has just been sworn in Washington. The prediction from everything he has said so far is, even if he doesn't actively drop Ukraine from his list of priorities, that he might just stop the funding. What do you see by the end of 2025 for your country?
Well, in the beginning of this war, there was no funding. I mean, the U.S. shut down its embassy, withdrew everyone from Ukraine, gave Ukraine 90 anti-tank missiles against thousands and thousands of tanks and armored vehicles, and said, good luck, have an insurgency like in Afghanistan, we'll check in a few years later. So it's not like the US has a magic wand. Yes, American help was very important in the later phases of the war, but Ukrainians are just not going to roll over and give up their existence in an existential war because Donald Trump tells them to.
Okay, well, that's an hopeful. I do want to come back later and find out what you think of India's position on the war as well.
The problem of Iraq, it's stuck between Iran and the US. So whenever the Iranian and the Americans want to have a war, want to have a fight, want to have an agreement or disagreement, it will be fought in the streets of Baghdad, Basra, Damascus, Aleppo, or kind of further south in Yemen. That's the problem. So whenever now there is the escalation and the rhetoric towards Iran, the threat of a strike on Iranian nuclear reactor, you see the first line of defense for Iran will be Iraq. And I'm not condemning Iran. I'm not saying, I mean, if the Americans come and invade the country next door, what would your country do? The first thing is to try to defend themselves in Iraq rather than defending themselves in Iran.
After all, the killing of Qasem Soleimani,
exactly.
When Trump was last there.
So that is the fear now that's happening in Baghdad. Baghdad is very peaceful these days. Everything's fine. Restaurants are open. But there is this anticipation, the fear that events in Syria and the Americans' rhetoric towards Iran will be reflected in Baghdad in terms of sanctions, military strikes, on the parallel paramilitaries that we have in Iraq.
Certainly, that Iraq once more will come into this cauldron. In your book, A Stranger in Your City, there's a paragraph that begins, Baghdad was no longer my city. It didn't matter that I'd lived there for 3 decades. I obtained several fake ID cards with different tribal and family names on each to be used in different parts of the city. For all of us, that's impossible to imagine. The idea that you're in your own city, you know everyone, you know the shopkeepers, and you have to take fake IDs just to do your job as a translator or a journalist. Tell me a bit about that. You wanted to read a little bit from your book as well.
So I mean, at the point I never left Baghdad. I was a military deserter. I couldn't get a passport. I tried to travel outside Iraq. I couldn't. So you end up living in Baghdad for 29 years, 28 years. And then suddenly the war happens. And then suddenly this neighborhood is Sunni, that neighborhood is a Shia. And I come from a family, my father was born in Basra, between 2 brackets, so he must be a Shia. But my grandfather came from northern Mosul, he must be a Sunni. And that ambiguity is very difficult in times of civil war when you're either Sunni, either Shia. There's nothing in between. So you have to get fake ID cards. And when you approach a checkpoint, you need subtle differences in the accent, and I'm sure kind of these stories are remembered in every society that is divided and has civil war. Subtle difference in the accent can lead to murder, can lead to death, kidnapping. He must be a Shia, he must be a Sunni, which is, of course, is absurd in a society, in a modern society like Iraq, where sectarian differences didn't matter anything since the 50s or 60s. It was a cultural differences. It meant a decision of life and death. And hence, you acquire 3 ID cards, your original one, 2 fake ones, and you have to remember the names of these fake mothers that you have, all the checkpoints. What's the name of my mother? What's the name of my fake mother?
I do feel some of it. I covered a riot in India once, and when I checked into the hotel, and as you can probably tell, I have my first name is from one religion, my last name from another, and when I checked into the hotel, they wouldn't let me use one of my names. They said because people come and check the register every night. So the difference between life and death is remembering your fake mothers is a good takeaway from all of this. And then there is the spotlight that you bring. It's a harsh spotlight. It makes all of us feel, especially those who have been foreign correspondents in another country, suddenly feel a little guilty. Because you write about being a translator, 2 foreign journalists living in a hotel where you once were, you swam, you ate at the bakery, you remember the croissant sandwiches there. And they have a very different lens on your country. You actually play games with them saying, How long will it take for this person to figure out exactly what I am? Because they can come and represent the whole world in Iraq, but when they meet an Iraqi journalist, they want to pigeonhole them somehow or the other. You also put a harsh spotlight on the life of, and I've been both, so I deal with this dichotomy, the life of a local journalist. You can be a translator. In the old days, luckily they have dropped that term in a lot of media companies, but in the old days we were all called fixers because you didn't just translate, you didn't just ensure that the president or prime minister of the country wanted to speak to your colleagues from abroad. You organized the cars, you organized the hotels, you organized the security at times as well. Was that difficult to be in your own country and yet have to deal with these foreign journalists who had this bizarre lens on your country?
I mean, of course, it's kind of this whole being pigeonholed, and I remember the first time I was with a journalist and I was translating, and he said, "Can you ask this lady, is she a Sunni or a Shia?" And I'm kind of in my head, it's like, why is that relevant? I mean, why? So because she's a Sunni, then related to the old regime, so she's a responsible, or a Shia as a victim? And that narrative of black and white, the victim and the victimized, is very strange. Once you enter this tunnel, you can't leave it. But also, I have to say I was very privileged because I'm an Iraqi. I'm traveling through my country for the first time because Saddam has gone and something. And someone is paying me money for it, to learn and be attached to those amazing journalists because I'm learning.
And in dollars.
And in dollars, I mean, I was being paid $50 every 3 months as an architect. And then suddenly this guy comes and says, "I'll give you $100. Oh, wow, $100 a month, amazing. A day.
A day.
Your life changes, your perspective changes and everything. But it's a very dangerous thing. And I think Christopher was talking about this yesterday. There is a very big danger that you end up being the Iraqi journalist covering Iraq for the rest of your life. And very early on, you want to not be identified as the local journalist. You want to know, I want to go to Lebanon, to Syria, to Yemen, to Afghanistan, to all these things. Learn from my experience, but take it to other places and at least not repeat the mistakes that I saw in my country.
Certainly. In an interview, and I think you referred to this a little bit, the lasting war. It's when the guns and the bombs and the missiles stop, but the sectarian conflict continues. And I think in an interview you were speaking about being in Turkey, perhaps, and where a lot of these wars are being thought out, and exiled communities are thinking about taking back their countries, and then they're getting help from others, and who are also vested interests in a certain sense in each of these conflicts. And you said that once you put the guns and bombs into a country, into a conflict, you can never really take them out.
It's so easy to form a militia. Any three of us can now go and fund a militia anywhere between Baghdad and Sana'a, and you can put guns in the hands of kids, pay them a few $100s, establish an emir, a commander, and whatnot. Disarming those guys takes decades because once you create, civil wars becomes very soon about money. In Yemen, for example, in Syria, those warlords realize they have so much power, the power of life and death on everyone in their street. I remember someone in Aleppo was telling me, this is the Republic of Abu Ali. And the Republic of Abu Ali was a destroyed street of, apartment block. Those guys, and they're always guys, men, who when they carry their guns and they taste power, and it's very hard to convince them to, give up the guns, leave that power, come back and be a normal citizen. So men with guns and power, it's the most lethal, dangerous combination, I think.
Absolutely. And I want to warn you that the book itself does not pull its punches when it comes to the blood and gore. As a journalist, sometimes you put that out. Yesterday I spoke about it being in black and white, but Ghaith actually writes about every little bit, including about your friend, the chess player. Do you want?
Yes, it is. I will read a paragraph from that later, but I think...
Go ahead now.
Okay. I can find my book. It's this guy is called Ali. He is a very nice guy, very sweet, loves music, is a very good, mean chess player. And being with Ali, there is another side, which is seeing Ali in conflict. and how you reconcile yourself to these facts. Because Ali also takes care of me during war, and he protects me, and he and his men. So, sorry. For the lucky ones, death was swift and quick. For Ammar, death was a luxury that he had to wait for. The officers did not see their victims as humans, let alone as fellow Iraqis. They were nothing but the ultimate enemy. It was there and then, when they heard the animal-like squealing of pain, when they saw the feed and the mighty IS, Islamic State soldiers begging for mercy, that they felt they had achieved their final victory over the caliphate. And yet perhaps the victory of the Islamic State lay in its ability to make the people adopt its own savagery. Those who were the most cruel in torturing the detainees were often the ones who had not seen actual combat. The unit's cook, the logistics officers, people who spent the war in the rear and not at the front lines. Ali left the room in disgust after witnessing the torture when he saw the torture. Why do you torture them? Just kill the men and get over with it. By midnight, the soldiers were tired of Ammar, and his face had been disfigured into lumps of black. He was taken to where his friend had been lying dead for a couple of hours. There is nothing noble about death in Mosul. The flies had gathered, dogs had already taken parts of his leg. Ammar was ordered to kneel a couple of meters away from his comrade's body. When watching the footage from the Spikers massacre, I always wonder what happened to the minds of people who are about to be executed. You know, you've seen this footage, you know, dozens of men were killed in trenches. And I realized in Mosul that people die before they are dead. Because when Ali came after Ammar and pointed his gun, he actually asked him, move a little bit so that the person taking the footage could have a better light. And Ammar, knowing he was going to die, actually complied and moved. And that's when Ali killed Ammar. And next day, he went back playing chess.
You will really get through this book very quickly because it's a story through somebody's eyes that have witnessed so much of this. Yaro, when we come to, and Yaroslav has two books. There's a nonfiction, and I do want to ask you later why you brought the nonfiction into this world of journalism in a sense, called No Country for Love. Sorry, the first one is Our Enemies Will Vanish, which is the nonfiction, and then there's No Country for Love, which is the fiction. And I'm sure you love them both equally.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, I think one is a prequel to the other in a way, because Our Enemies Will Vanish is a book about the current war in Ukraine. And the novel is a historical novel about what actually happened in Ukraine in the darkest decades of the 20th century, when Ukraine was probably the deadliest place on earth. You know, there was the artificial famine in which millions died. Then there was the execution of the Ukrainian cultural elites. Then there was the war, the Holocaust, and the insurgency that followed the war. And I think the secret to Ukraine's resilience now is that everyone in Ukraine is descended from the survivors of that very dark period. And they know that, you know, it's bloody, it's gruesome, the destruction is tremendous. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians were killed or maimed in these 3 years of war, but the alternative is worse, because surrender would mean returning to this genocidal past. And the Russians are pretty open about their intentions. You know, whenever a town or a village is occupied in Ukraine, the first thing they do is they destroy the monument to the victims of the famine, because they say it never happened. So you have this conflicting narrative. Ukrainians are saying never again, and the Russians say, well, it never happened, and we can also repeat.
Yeah, it's actually interesting. Both of you refer to it in different ways. You speak about the idea that Russia has said, you're not really a country, you won't exist. Ghaith writes about, all the foreigners who came in and said, Iraq is a foreign construct. Actually, the answer is breaking it up a little bit, and this side goes to these people and that side goes to those people. Another thing you write about in that moment when, the war has now come to Kyiv, is that moment where you say it just doesn't feel right to wear a helmet and a flak jacket, a bulletproof jacket on these streets.
Yeah, so like Ghaith, I started off as a fixer. In the falling days of the Soviet Union, I was only paid $50 a day. But then I left the country, and I spent almost 2 decades covering wars in other countries. I lived in Afghanistan, Iraq, elsewhere. And so I came back full-time to Ukraine for the first time in January 2022 as a reporter. And I stayed there pretty much the whole year. And so, so this is the passage that I will... no, it's okay. I'll just need to put my glasses. And so this is on February 28th, which is day 5 of the war. And the Russians had just tried to enter Kiev and were repelled. And Kiev had a 3-day curfew. Nobody was allowed to leave apartments. It felt wrong to wear on the streets of my own hometown the vest and the helmet that I'd donned hundreds of times in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. By the botanical gardens where I used to go on dates in high school and planted my awkward first kiss. By the museum where I used to spend afternoons gazing at French Impressionist paintings. By the cinema where as a teenager I had watched Fellini's movies, their more sensual scenes removed by the Soviet censors. The city that invaders had come to take had been my home. The Russians thought it was theirs, in a country that they believed didn't exist. Part of a nation that they told themselves had been invented. Kiev seemed on its deathbed, listless, blood of its people. How dare they, I thought.
The idea, journalists live with a huge sense of grievance, right? We go around the world, we're always talking about injustice. We feel very strongly that we are on the side of the oppressed, and we think that the oppressor has no business to do what they're doing. But as I said, it doubles down when it's your own country and how you feel about it. I want to first do you want to tell our audience why your book is called Our Enemies Will Vanish?
Well, this is a line from the Ukrainian national anthem. It goes like, it's actually a very Pacific one. It's our enemies will vanish like dew at sunrise. Kind of just go. We don't want any blood. So, and it was written in the 1860s when the Ukrainian language was banned in Ukraine, and you could not print books in Ukrainian. And when the whole idea of an independent Ukraine was a very unlikely dream. And yet, it exists. It persists, and people kept sort of referring to this line in my conversations throughout the war, and which made me put it on the cover.
All right, an important line from a national anthem, which can mean so many different things depending on who says them and what the context of what they're saying is. In Ukraine, in 2022, there was a very different idea of what was going to follow. Most people, I think, very cynically or maybe hardened or fatigued by all that we had seen. And I keep coming back to this theme of look at the decade we're living in. From the beginning of this decade, it's like pound, pound, pound. Ordinary citizens around the world have felt the trauma of one problem or another. And nobody really gave Zelensky a chance. Here was this former comedian. Here was the might of Russia. And I remember a Twitter survey in India that asked a question about comparing President Ghani of Afghanistan, and you were actually there when he left the country on 15th August 2021, and President Zelensky in February 2022, saying that I will stand and fight. And the actual question in that Twitter survey was, who do you think has done better by their own people? Ghani, who left so as to avoid more bloodshed and the peaceful takeover of Kabul, although it was by force by the Taliban, or Zelensky, who says, I will stand and fight, and is going to lose a lot of people and probably lose the war anyway. Why do you think Zelensky said he would stand and fight?
Well, I think, let's go back to the very nature of this war, because, I hear what Ghaith was saying about how suddenly Iraq fractured in this, sectarian zones. People in former Yugoslavia, in Lebanon, had to go through similar experiences. The uniqueness of Ukraine was that it didn't happen. But it was misread, because people in Moscow, people in Washington were saying, well, half of Ukrainians speak Russian. So if the Russians invade, I'm sure they will side with the Russians because they're different. In fact, Ukrainian nationalism was very civic. And Ukraine now has a Jewish president, a Muslim minister of defense, and the head of the armed forces who was actually an ethnic Russian born in Russia. And that doesn't seem to bother anyone, because the fight was not for some sort of ethnic supremacy. The fight was for a different future. And even if Zelensky had stepped down and decided to follow up on and listen to the advice he was giving by Biden or Boris Johnson and flee, Ukraine would still have resisted. And it's very different. A war against a foreign invader in which pretty much everyone is united is very different from a war in Afghanistan where, President Ghani was an American citizen brought in by the US.
It was more an internal push, if you like. What do you think of India's role in all of this? India has not yet issued a statement condemning Russia's invasion. We've said we're for peace, that the only way forward is talks, not something President Zelensky is taken very kindly to.
Well, India has been neutral. It has been abstaining in all the UN resolutions on Ukraine. And I think for people in Ukraine, it's very hard to understand why, because what is happening in Ukraine is a colonial war. It's perhaps the bloodiest colonial war of modern times. What the Russian goal is very clear. They want to annex Ukraine. They already announced the annexation of several parts of it, and want to take the rest. And it's hard for Ukraine to understand why Indians who have suffered so much from colonialism and atrocities of colonialism in the past do not see through that prism.
Certainly, and of course, on the Indian side, there's a sense that there's a context for what Russia has done, and there is a future which involves talks and all the rest. One of the things I saw when reading the book, just as I saw with Ghaith, there was a lot of blood and gore. With Yaroslav's book, it was, my God, the Ukrainians use the F word a lot. It's there all over the book, but in particular, it was there where you quote a Putin comment.
Well, yeah, as the nation was shocked and was finding itself in its first days of the war, legends became very important. And one of these legends was there's an island called Snake Island, which had a tiny garrison of Ukrainian border guards. And the mightiest Russian warship in the Black Sea, cruiser Moskva, approached that island and told them, surrender. This is a Russian warship. Surrender or you will be destroyed. And this was all over radio waves. So people in Ukraine, in Odessa, were listening to this traffic. And the soldiers on the island said, Russian warship, go F yourself. And then the communication ended. And the assumption was that all the soldiers were killed. But this became the rallying cry. On every billboard in Ukraine, on every street, it was dubbed, Russian warship, go F yourself. And in fact, the soldiers did not die. In fact, they actually surrendered, and they were later traded in prisoner exchanges. But what did happen is that 3 months later, the cruiser, the flagship of the Russian Black Sea, was sank by the Ukrainians.
All right, I just had one question for both of you. And, I faced the question myself. So I do want to ask you, Yaroslav, if the war does not go Ukraine's way, will it be difficult for you as a Ukrainian to accept that Russia is winning the war? On the outside, there are many who say, Russia is never going to vacate the territory they've taken on the ground at a table. They're never going to give that back at a table. It'll have to be fought back. To fight it back, you would need a lot more firepower and manpower than you have at this moment. In that kind of scenario, Would you be able to?
Well, I mean, it's not up to me to accept or not reality. Reality is reality. But, nothing is preordained. We just saw in Syria, and in 1 week, the regime that, everybody was now rushing to recognize suddenly crumbled and collapsed. So nothing is forever.
Nothing is forever. Ghaith, is it hard for you to criticize your own country? Is there a bit of self-censorship?
So there was a moment in 2019 when there was this very popular young uprising in the streets of Baghdad, and the youths came to the streets, demonstrating against the corruption of the ruling, basically the ruling militia warlords that kind of took over Iraq after the 2003 war. And that is the moment when I was invested as emotionally in the streets. You can see your own people, you can see your own, it no longer became a Sunni or a Shia anymore. So it was a very popular uprising. And I was covering that uprising, and I saw the kids being killed by the militias and all these things. I loved that uprising, and it failed, the uprising, as all uprisings do in the end. And that was a moment of harsh reality that it took me a whole year trying to say, no, but it didn't fail. No, there will be something like that. But you have to accept, as Yaro says, it's not for us to decide what will happen.
The outcomes.
We have to, in the end, be witnesses and write what was happening.
A friend of mine actually wrote, well said. A friend of mine actually used the term internal exiles and said that it becomes the way station between the reality and what our hopes are, and somehow helps us heal, really, as we see what's happening in the world. So thanks so much to both of you. I do have time for some audience questions. Do you want to just quickly put up your hands so I know where I'm coming? There's a lady up front. Maybe I'll take 2 questions and come back to you for the ending.
First of all, thank you very much for bringing the conflict near to us. Distance often makes it number. It's easy to forget and live your own lives. Just in that respect, very quickly, I just wanted to understand, we talk about resilience of the ordinary folk. Because
just 1 sec. If you're leaving, please do so, but quietly, because somebody is still speaking here. Thank you.
So, yeah, thanks. So just wanted to get your view, we talk about resilience of the ordinary folks, really driving the world, in conflicts. Could you just talk a little bit more around resilience? Where does humor come into the situation in such dire situations as well? Where do you find that relief? But thank you very much for a beautiful, beautiful session. Thank you.
There are actually moments of humor in both their books which kind of take you by surprise. One gentleman in yellow over there at the back. Right there.
Question for Ghaith. You've seen what Israel has done to the Iranians, to the Hezbollah in Lebanon. And so do you see an impact of that, the withdrawal of the Shiite, support for Iran in Iraq? Can that happen and the country come together in some way?
It's an interesting question. We were having some kind of conversation about that. One lady at the back, and that's my last question. Yeah, just stand up so that they know where to come. Yeah.
My question is to both the gentlemen here, the fixers. I am one too.
I was one too.
Great, I am one too. So my question is this, that most of the times I don't find myself just fixing schedules and meetings, but also trying to give them pegs for the real perspective on ground, whereas they have a broad outline of the story in their mind. Sometimes I succeed, sometimes I don't. But I am not the one who has the access to the foreign media and the target audience. They have. And sometimes the story that goes out is, as what Suhasini really said, was bizarre. So have you faced it? Does it frustrate you? What's your take on this?
Sometimes I feel like the story is written on the flight in rather than on the way out. Okay, 3 great questions. Please take them as you would like.
So I will start by answering the Iran element. I think one of the biggest outcomes of the October 7th and the Israel war on Gaza is there was a concept called the unity of the battlefields created after the defeat of ISIS. So Iranian commanders, Hezbollah fighters, Palestinians, Yemenis, and everyone coming together in one big battlefield. That idea has crumbled, and the fall of Bashar is a direct outcome to the weakening of Hezbollah in Iran. Now that in itself is an event. The danger, if you can try to replicate the same thing in Iraq by trying to defeat the militias by engineering something like that, and that can lead to another further war. Humor is very important. If you know the amounts of Sunni Shia jokes in Baghdad that only came out of the 2003, and for the fixer, you can do whatever you can, you can try to tell them, and then the rest is for Allah.
Hope you educate them on a broader level. Yeah?
Well, I think that nobody is funnier than soldiers facing death in the trenches. They really, really know how to joke. And I guess that's how you cope, right? Humor is a coping mechanism. As for fixers, well, I'm probably also guilty of not listening to my fixer's advice in some places. But I think the issue is this. So in an ideal situation, when you come from outside, you hopefully bring an informed outside perspective that also sees some things that the local journalist does not see because she or he has not been able to connect the dots and talk to other people outside that environment. But we talked about this yesterday. It's very important in journalism to see the macro and the micro, to understand the detail, but also to be able to zoom out and see the bigger picture.
And when you write your books, since we do have 1 minute left, I do want to ask you, as a journalist who, we churn out stuff on a daily basis. How much more difficult is it to put out a book? Does it just add up together? And I think you've written that journalism is the first draft of history, and this is the second draft in a sense.
I mean, for me, it was too, because also I was writing in a language that was not mine. So I learned English very late in my life, and writing in English is a big challenge in itself. So this is why it took me 20 years. Hopefully the next one is less than 20 years.
And Yaro is not thinking about it yet, but I'm seeding the idea that he's going to write a book about his Iraq connection. Tell us about that.
I was just talking, my family may have had this slight role in the troubles of Iraq because my uncle was a violinist in the Kiev Opera, and when he was young, he was sent to Baghdad to teach violin to the Iraqi vice president, whose name was Saddam Hussein.
And I blamed the uncle because Saddam didn't learn violence, so he decided to become a dictator and invade the next country.
The rest, as they say, is history. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. You've been a great audience.